Over the past several days, Murdoch has variously capitalized on his innate stealthiness, shedding the company of the other two companions and venturing out into this network of dilapidated streets that make up the part of Kirk that the companions have so far managed to at least partly explore. And in the process of his explorations, Murdoch has occasionally crept through a rather unappealing side street, a winding road that, truth be told, does not really deserve the name, and has there in the mud come across a game of sorts in progress, a series of lines bisected and filled in at least partly by circles and X's. And since Murdoch has in fact been a child, he did not come to life as a 35-year-old smartass. He recognizes this for what it is, a simple children's game, played here in the mud of a deteriorating town under a chaos dome. And since he's a lateral thinker, he figures where there is a game, there is probably a player. So how do I perhaps lure out or interact with the player? Well, over the past couple of days during his explorations, Murdoch has made a point of returning here, making his own lines in the mud, and starting off by just drawing a circle in the upper left corner of the grid, returning a few hours later to find that somebody has indeed placed at the center of it all an X. And as this game goes on over the hours and days, as Murdoch forays, taking breaks from his underground work and the clearing of the passage, he finds himself wondering whether this is enough to provoke an encounter with whoever is leaving those marks. And before long, under a waxing gibbous quarter moon, on the 9th of Shiga, 13 years after the fall of Wyndham, he does indeed, losing the game by an ill-advised final mark, but making thereby the acquaintance of a rather strange local who reveals herself in a most peculiar way, a way that gives Murdoch pause and, while he doesn't feel directly threatened, puts him on edge, as in that disheveled scenery around him of collapsed hovels, piles of refuse, and other broken pieces of the everyday, two of them suddenly appear unlike they had before. Because what to Murdoch's eyes initially was a broken down handcart and a pile of old rags next to it, within the next blink of an eye turns into an old woman sitting next to a very much functioning handcart that is, much to Murdoch's surprise, piled rather high with a cargo of books, most of which, to his trained eye of the expensive book connoisseur and absconder, seem ruined, barely held together wood pulp between placards of leather bindings, but there are a few that look quite valuable, although you would of course be hard-pressed to find a customer under these reduced circumstances. She sits hunched over her shoulders, slumped, her posture indicating tiredness or perhaps age, as she is definitely, her soft skin notwithstanding, a couple of generations ahead of Murdoch as far as it comes to time lived. Her rosy cheeks give her a somewhat grandmotherly appearance, even though perhaps of the slightly mad, cackling kind, as the bristles of her hair stand out on end in all directions, and her drab thrown together borderline rags don't help much to dispel this general impression. Meeting her gaze, Murdoch's first impression is that this is neither a here nor there kind of person, One who is somewhere in the middle, hedging her bets and just trying to survive by hiding and perhaps maintaining a studied sense of neutrality. And as she finally speaks to address him, he has to bend forward and lean in closely to make out the words between all the slurred syllables and disjointed mumblings that are in fact meant for him.
You're not very good at this game. You're not very good at this game.
And Murdoch concedes this fact with a bow, having perhaps clearly been somewhat less invested in actually winning this than his now revealed opponent. I do indeed submit to your superior skill. I do hope you forgive me for my curiosity about my esteemed opponent, he says, again staring at this pile of books. Are you out and about looking for a scenic spot to read? And that elicits a mumbling cackle from the old lady. And between her ramblings, Murdoch makes out that it seems she is out and about most days to satisfy her curiosity, except it seems when it's raining, because according to her that is ruining her hair. And while she does indeed read her books and tries to find new ones constantly, she also believes in parting with a thing when it is no longer useful to her, and thus offers to Murdoch to perhaps buy some of the works that she no longer requires, for whatever purpose it is that drives her to do this. And as he spends some time with her, there is a distinct off-putting quality to the old bookseller that, despite his piqued curiosity, makes him want to avoid being in her company longer than he really has to, in case whatever ill fate has befallen her is somehow catching. He is, however, curious about her books and wonders idly what payment method she would accept, and also her potential as a witness to the things that have happened here. And so he stays a little while longer to quiz this strange, cursed, slightly mad figure as another sunset creeps under the Chaos Dome. Hello friends, Anderson here. Welcome back to Dungeon 23, week 3, the third full week of building stuff for EVENNIGHT. And now we've built the bookseller, but we're not quite done yet, because I'd really like to figure out sort of like 3 books that she has on offer and what they could possibly do for a group of players here, what kind of a benefit they have. We could also build, while we're up here, the Old Town Cemetery that is still left open and that we still have as a room to design. But beyond that, for today, what I had in mind is to go up, to go towards the Pitmaster, zoom past the Pitmaster's arena, and start constructing our way towards the keep and what I assume is our backdrop for the final confrontation with Orin. It is the 9th of Shiga now. We have another 6 or so days to go to full moon, when we can visit the moon door again and find out what the deal is with Orin's sister, who I initially thought was a tragic specter, but now I have a few other ideas, so let's see which direction the oracles will take us when we get there. But like I said, for now I would like to explore past here, specifically towards the northeast, and perhaps discard this southern passage here, mainly due to time constraints that we can't really link it up and put enough interesting stuff there within the time that we've left in this month before we need to resolve our final confrontation with Orin and move on to the next biome. But first, some book titles. We use the ultimate toolbox here. We have book title tables, so I will roll a die 6 to pick the table and a die 20 to pick the book title. In which case, 1 to 3, table 1, 4 to 6, table 2. And that gives us Emerald and Glory, Demon God Rising by Angus, and Dream, Demon, and Night. There's a certain demonic theme here, but I think that goes for the majority of the entries in this table, so that's not particularly serendipitous. That's just how the table is written. I feel like there is something we can milk here, especially the by Angus gives me pause. I don't want to make a decision here. I think I'm just going to ask our oracle. So if I roll under 13, which would be a yes, then Angus is one of the King's Valiants. 11, he is. Okay, so this is perhaps something more of a clue for a future encounter for another Valiant in another area. But we know that Angus is a theorist of demonology, and that should give us an idea at least of some components of what their zone and, well, overall areas of interests and potential responsibilities are or were. Beyond that, one could of course use one of these books to sell to a player to acquire a handful of new random spells or something like that. And of course, we need to figure out what the desired barter transaction here is for this bookseller, because I don't think coin is going to cut it. But the answer is kind of staring us right in the face. It boils down to, would you like to play a game? Now, I think in a group game, this is potentially much more engaging, where you could actually really do something tangible with this. In a solo game, a little less so. It effectively either boils down to an ability test, or possibly just randomly taking like the dungeon dressings book from GM's Miscellany and taking a random riddle from the back of the book and just trying to solve it without looking up the answer. That might also work. Since Murdoch doesn't really have any tools in his kit right now as far as his demon allies go that would be acceptable here, I think he's playing this pretty much straight, and since this is also quite random in a way and not that skill-based, we'll just roll a die 20 for the bookseller and for Murdoch and see who rolls higher, and whoever rolls higher is the winner. Accompanied by the mutterings of frustration from the bookseller as Murdoch closes his last row of 3, smirking somewhat triumphantly, he then turns to the cards and looks at those 3 still usable books spread out on top of the pile of, well, effectively useless pulp. And he settles on grabbing the second of the 3, Demon God Rising by Angus. And again, accompanied by outraged mumblings, he takes possession of the tome and casually, somewhat offhandedly asks the bookseller, "Who do you usually play against?" glancing at the other games in the mud. The answer, stammered out between fragments of incomprehensible chatter, is not one that makes Murdoch particularly happy, as the bookseller tells him that the games she plays, she usually plays against the ghosts from the old cemetery down the road. And since it's not particularly far from where the card was revealed, Murdoch can't help himself, and his curiosity needs some satisfaction here as a little icing on the top of this weird serving that he's had for this particular day already. So he creeps a little closer to this cemetery to take a look, and I guess that gives us a nice opportunity to actually build it as one of our rooms, the first one today. Now, I've put a few thoughts into this, and what I already feel I know about it is that the majority of these graves will have been disturbed, rooted up, with remains scattered throughout, just as part of Oren's ascension or descent into whatever form he is now, requiring some material to populate his shadow of a town, and thus raising, subconsciously potentially even, all the remains buried here, except some of them were too far gone for that to really work, and so that's kind of all a mess lying about. Now, we do remember there's a hero's grave here, which has some potential benefit, and I've thought about this too. The description that we rolled up from the city book, the random city table book by Dr. Tim Woods, we have a rather obscured hero's grave here, which puts me in mind of it being like covered in ranks of ivy. I'm picturing sort of a deteriorating statue. And as I was trying to figure out who this hero is and what we could do with them, I hit upon the idea that this statue could hold a clue, because it also bears on its belt a very striking sword. And putting two and two together, if one would remove that ivy that overgrows it and actually take a look at it, it'd be rather easy to figure out that the hero that used to be buried here is currently standing outside the moon door with a sword on their belt and is thus the reanimated corpse, which then put me in mind of the useful element we could place here in this particular room is a tomb content of this hero. So there is like a tomb dig down in this, which I think we should build, and I think there should also be kind of an encounter. I'm kind of free designing here based off of already generated information, so I'm not rolling a whole lot. I just kind of feel like this stuff suggests itself from a perspective of we can't just randomly throw everything together and hope it makes sense. Sometimes we just have to connect a few elements we've already established. So down there, I think in this hero's tomb, which is kind of an unassuming, just square, boxy room, but with a sarcophagus in, there is somewhere there discarded a religious pendant, maybe of Thorvath, and that pendant can be used to gain an advantage in the fight against this returned, reanimated corpse. So either as a turn undead or as a weaken kind of affair, which can be used to make the encounter either easier or trivialize it completely. Now, there are no clerics as such in the Black Sword hack system, so we don't really have a turn mechanic, but we can assume that with the pendant in hand, an appropriate ability check will work against the difficulty of the level differential between the wight and the caster, and then we can see what kind of effect we can generate. But since I also don't want to make it just a room with a pendant, I feel like we can put some kind of a carrion creature down there that's made its lair in this obscured hole in the ground leading into this subterranean chamber. It seems like a natural thing to do. So let's actually just make this room here as a sidebar, call it the tomb under the overgrown statue, and give it like an old sarcophagus in here, and then we put like a carrion creature encounter. I might actually just make it carrion crawlers because they're about as classic as it gets, and I tend to like using them. So there's a nest of carrion crawlers down there who've been steadily munching away at the remains that weren't reanimated, that were too far gone to be reanimated, or too perhaps in the grace of the gods to be reanimated. This would make it a 7-3, and we have discarded pendant here, which can be found, maybe needs to be looked for because it's like under a pile of bones that the carrion crawlers have dumped there. And I think access is through like a hole in the ceiling, which leads up to the kind of the side of this ivy-covered statue base. So there's the statue base, a block that this statue is standing on, half already fallen apart, with this sword obscured by these growths of vines, and also hanging off the growths of vines, kind of obscuring this hole in the ground that the carrion crawlers enter and exit through, which means it's not immediately obvious that there is a downstairs and a hole, and you just effectively, when you enter first, you see this covered statue. Now let's dress the A72, the Old Town Cemetery, up a little bit more. I think since we've already started on the plant journey, we can just give 3 properties to these vines and make it an unusual plant from the Tome of Adventure Design, and then just add a random dungeon dressing to the place with the landmark of the statue. That's already pretty much enough for this one. Interesting. So the plant itself is fleshy and bloated. The special plant part are the roots, which kind of makes it tricky that this will ever be found. And the special thing about the roots is that they have a strangely human shape, which for a cemetery kind of vine plant is pretty much perfect. So presumably if one were to be alchemically inclined or something like this, perhaps this could be dug up and then used as a powerful ingredient of some sort, like a mandrake kind of thing. And our regular old dungeon dressing gives us an unusual corpse, which makes me think this might be the rest of the parts that belong to the elf skull lying in the fighting pit of the pitmaster, who may or may not be an elf or some kind of fey creature, but regardless, it will be like an obviously humanoid but non-human corpse without a head, because the head is lying a little further up the road. So that gives us a decapitated quote-unquote elf corpse and fleshy vines with mandrake roots overgrowing the statue, which holds the entrance into A7-3, which then gives us the opportunity to plant another couple of dungeon dressings in A7-3 in the downstairs tomb, and I guess we'll use the items from a royal tomb again. And down there through the hole in the darkness of this burial chamber with its slimy, skittering occupants coiled around the sarcophagus, filling it up almost completely. There atop the sarcophagus is a slightly angled, ornate stone slab, which the likeness of the buried hero down here clasps between the hands like a shield, and it lists their achievements in life and looks withered enough to have been here for many generations. And unassumingly just discarded off to the side, perhaps as the reanimated form rose from its resting place and pushed the sarcophagus lid aside just enough to make an escape, is a bent and broken circlet that once adorned the head of this now reanimated heroic form. So we have the broken circlet and the slab of deeds here as our dressing, and I think that makes for a pretty nice cohesive whole with this old cemetery, and also gives it kind of an added value and purpose for the exploration and overcoming the combat encounter, then finding the pendant, of course, all provided one puts like 2 and 2 together by disposing of the vines and latching onto this imagery of this strikingly, uniquely designed sword or scabbard and sword combination to understand that the buried one here is the one standing down in the crypta. And before we actually let Murdoch loose on this space, or rather probably the party, because I don't think he's gonna go exploring cemeteries really on his own, I'd like to go ahead a bit further and build on past the arena here. So what I want to do is kind of truncate this off with a chaos break here, so there is no progress, but these two will go towards the keep as we've already decided. So we'll build off from the boss arena of the pitmaster towards the keep, because we have to really make our way there. And from a design perspective, with 2 forking paths now, I'd like to do a double option kind of thing with how a party might be able to reach the keep. One being the more obviously blocked off route that requires perhaps some fighting or some stealth to negotiate, because we remember that closer to the keep, this is where the zombie reanimated corpse patrols are probably a bit more intense, and that's where they usually walk around. But the other option then should be one that is maybe, well, first needs to be found, and it's maybe like a subterranean approach, and there are also some dangers, maybe more of a trap or natural hazard or some kind of other nature there that would give some choice to how one wants to make it to the keep for the final confrontation, whether the direct route or the more indirect approach. I guess this is kind of depending on party sensibilities really, and player preference as well. So let's make this the approach to the more obvious resistance that leads towards the patrolling guards, and let's maybe also ramp up the nature of Orin as the torture executioner, which duties probably befell him since they're a bit ignoble because he was obviously disloyal and did something to displease Alaric, but now express themselves in a lot more gruesome decorations, quote unquote, in the lead up to the seat of Orin's power. And since I do want to gain some distance here, I'd like to make this A8. And what I'm picturing here is sort of gallows standing there and spikes with impaled, still twitching, reanimated corpses on them, and a set of fires burning, much like the one down in the south, all boxed in by these collapsed ruins. And I also suspect that what we need to establish somewhere up here as one of the next rooms is kind of the guard post where the zombies actually congregate, halfway point kind of or closer to the keep. Now let's dress it up a bit here, our approach, our one alternative route into the keep direction. What I don't want to really do is seed another encounter here. I think at least a combat encounter. I would like to seed an encounter here, but not of the fighty kind, because we've just coming off a mini boss fight with the pitmaster in the previous access point, which is gonna make any other combat encounter immediately right after feel a little bit anticlimactic. So let's not do that, but I would like to have, well, some dungeon dressing, and that should probably hit home the abandoned nature of all of this. So I will use GM's Miscellany, the dungeon dressing book, and we're specifically gonna just go for junk and rubbish, because that also has some D100 tables in here that we can use. Let's go for the triple. A first glance down this wider town street with its muddy flagstones draws the eye inevitably towards the grisly arrangements of corpses, some of which still animate and twitching through no natural life in them, however, impaled upon long spikes, others dangling from gallows or strung up again like a rather morbid banner between roof beams jutting from the ruins to the side of the road, the fires that line the street at an irregular interval, casting everything in a very unreal light with tall dancing shadows on the piles of rubble that once were houses. And so the fine detail gets lost to some extent unless one takes a closer look, and perhaps the observer eventually notices a pile of pieces that do tell a story of their own. Lying to the side of the road, discarded, a couple of half-broken wooden prosthetic arms and a handful of wooden legs next to a half-broken bear trap with one of its spiked arms missing. And even further along on the muddy ground, a porcelain doll without eyes that, were one to pick it up by one of its mud-stained limbs, when held upside down, croaks the word mama. Well, that certainly amped up the creep factor, didn't it? A bunch of rubbish there that works quite well. So I've already decided I want a passive encounter here, because I feel like the bookseller was quite a hit, atmospherically speaking. So let's see what we can get from Perplexing Ruins' campaign notebook again. Die 88 settlement encounters, black goes first. 85. You've got to be kidding me. A masked executioner with a large squared sword. Well, that's very on brand and really fitting to the circumstances here, so I'm not gonna disregard that one. I very much bow to the wisdom of the dice here. Still, I'm not really into the idea of just throwing another combat encounter out here, so maybe helpful though as kind of a menacing aspect to drive a party, seeing this person stand maybe here to examine an alternative path. So that could work in our favor to also give incentive to go looking for a way around. And maybe we can make it so that this masked executioner actually is rather single-minded on their work, so they will only leap into action and do their job if the condemned arrive in the usual fashion, like on the back of a card or something, and their proclamation of sentencing is read, which I'm assuming is what periodically happens here, as they sort of go through the motions of this every now and again and execute some undead villagers only to do it all again and reanimate them again and stuff like that. So this executioner will just stand there if the party walks up and not really acknowledge or interact with them at all, just kind of hang out and wait for the next delivery so they can impale a few more on spikes or something. Of course, should the party attack, then we'll yoink some stats and make that happen, but it's not inherently an active combat encounter. It's a passive encounter, which can completely be bypassed. It just really lends itself to adding to the creep factor of this by having this figure standing there and giving a false sense of what is about to happen. Let's roll up another room shape, an unusual one to make the map a little bit more interesting here at the end of this all, where we could potentially place our guard post that hosts the zombie patrols that occasionally come down to mass. It gives us a sort of a 25 by 45 meter, 80 times 150 foot rectangular-ish shape, but with two smaller side areas to make it a bit more interesting. Shaping it a little like this and also making it a little bit smaller because that was actually pretty huge. Adding our ruins, and I think this is very clearly the town square, so there is a main assembly, perhaps the market is being held here, and we'll have the guardhouse be, I guess, in a fairly prominent position sort of here, and give it a little bit of an odd shape to line up with the rest of this. So this is the guard barracks. We shall dub the A9. And since we are dealing with a town square here, I think it's special feature time again. That's a 6 on the strange locations table and gives us a hidden ecosystem, which says a strangely vibrant ecosystem of thriving flora and fauna can be found here, somehow surprisingly healthy for the climate and conditions in which they are growing. Let's maybe have chaos intrude here. So this is truncated off and growing on the ruins here and all the way off to the side a little, initially not visible, are strange plants, because we do have some tables to generate them with some interesting side effects, which could also then be another thing for Quinn to study in regards to the warping effect of chaos on its environs. Maybe actually this is a ruined sort of arboretum, fancier way of saying there's some kind of an old greenhouse that was here where somebody was growing a variety of plants, perhaps the town alchemist's house. That would make sense, and then we can assume that the chaos coming in and warping things around it just did something to the variety of plants there, and they formed some, well, we'll roll for what it formed, but that's a cool feature, I like it. I think A10 is the guard barracks. We still need to dress up the town square a bit more, I find. Of course, these were also the fancier houses. And maybe let's have chaos come in here again as well. Yeah. Just to explain why there is like another road not going off away from here. So it's always where I'm just imagining this sudden sheer swirling blackness streaked with a variety of just exploding colors that flash across the eye every now and again, and it's really hard to look at. It sort of hurts your eyeballs because it makes no sense that suddenly matter stops being a thing, but that this creeps in all over the place here. And is it expanding or not? Who knows? I think maybe it has expanded, but we're also in the 13th year of this already, which kind of is the culmination of all of this. So perhaps this is as far as it's gonna get before whatever the climax of this dome development happens. Let's maybe grab some decor from this and some weird dungeon dressing from the Tome of Adventure Design to finish the job. And it gives us as the centerpiece of this square a village tree, the original generations old massive tree that has now turned into a brooding, dark, leafless, hanging tree that is dangling with corpses strung up on ropes, really rather symbolizing the shift that has befallen this town of Galekirk. And off to a side here, a somewhat sad scene where a crow has curiosity overcoming its good senses, gotten itself and its head stuck in a discarded glass bottle lying in front of the guard barracks, and is only moving weakly now, fatigued after struggling against it for who knows how long. So let's take care of our unusual plant real quick. And these plants that shoot out from around this chaos shift that intrudes upon the side street here grow in rather strange shapes. They are aligning in geometrical patterns that are much too straight and intentional for this to just be a natural occurrence. And notably also that the leaves of the plant that stick to the vines that are creating these shapes have a very strange fleshy appearance, almost like tongues that suggest a consistency that is very much not plant-like. I think this is a pretty nice opportunity to do something rather unexpected. This is actually a potential food source for a party, since these leaves are edible without any additional risk. They just are edible and taste quite nice, but who on earth is ever going to try this? So if you're wanting to play up kind of the survivalist aspect of this is maybe an unexpected sort of red herring kind of thing where there is a potential source of nourishment that is, however, of a very suspect source. Now let's do the guard barracks. I kind of transpose them over here to make it a bit easier to fill them with some detail. And I think we'll do like a ground floor, first floor arrangement here. So we have 2 stories here, which makes this A10 and A10-2. Now I'm gonna put an exclamation point here and here and here because of the guards doing like patrols. So they will not all be in the barracks at all times. They will be variously walking around. So you're basically gonna determine the amount of zombie guards in here and potentially encountered outside, depending on preference and frequency of combat encounters, of course. And you're not just gonna wipe them all out by attacking one location. We can always assume that they're not all clustered in one place, so you're going to always have the potential to run into another patrol of zombie guards with their pikes and spears and their rapier-bearing lieutenants. So in this case, we can also assume the dungeon die doesn't really need to do the work here because we have to have these encounters here. I think A10-2 is like the only place where we should be doing the dungeon dice roll to see if maybe we can also place down another clue or something like that, or maybe a passive encounter. Let's put a little bit of variety to use. Let's use the general table from OSRIC and maybe furnishings and torture chamber. This guard station surely has seen better days, opening the creaking door to a room that has a fetid air to it with a damp floor caused by a hole in both the roof and the ceiling separating the ground from the first floor, where the elements can intrude unchecked, having caused the rot and collapse of most of the furniture on this side of the room. And what's left is a large table with some chairs standing by it that also, depending on the encounter roll here, will host a number of zombie guards sitting there as they're not out on active patrol. And lying on the table is a set of thumb screws. I think the first floor we can already make a few decisions here, that we have sort of a number of bunk beds here, obviously in pretty bad shape, and we do general furnishing and torture chamber content again. Climbing up the flight of stairs into the first floor of this guardhouse, again the elements have done their damage, leading to a pile of moldy refuse lying around here on the floor, with a strangely untouched statue of Torvath that seems to be taken care of still as the centerpiece of the far wall, and next to the bed's sack at the foot of one of the beds, and oddly enough a door leading out the room that is in bad repair and just stands half open, exposing the fact that there is nothing actually behind it but a sheer drop. And examining that drop below it on the ground level again, a debris covered trapdoor that leads to a simple deep hole and cavern in the ground that was in the past, and perhaps still is, used as a fire and forget prisoner storage, an oubliette, where the expectation was that this is an excruciating method of execution, so the condemned was pushed off the first floor into the hole to very, very likely break at least their legs, if not their neck, mercifully, in the first drop, and then left to languish until they inevitably starved to death or ran out of rainwater and died of thirst before that. Let's maybe half bury this trapdoor under a pile of rubble here, so it's really mainly visible. Like, oubliette trapdoor only visible from upstairs due to rubble, which means that the intrepid explorer looking down from up high will see that there is something to be seen, which also means we should probably make this another room, A10-3, and then roll our dungeon die for A10-2. Which presents us with the amazing discovery that there are items to be found here, but it's junk, so we'll roll it from GM's Miscellany. 01, an iron helmet with a dent in it, so that's in the sack. And I think for the oubliette contents, we can actually roll up a settlement encounter and go with the general theme, bending it, of course, to the specific circumstances. I think based on the nature of this, there isn't really anything in there, but we might run into a strange NPC or semi-lucid undead again or something. That would be an interesting, nice discovery to see there, because it also takes some to even find it. So could be worthwhile. Let's roll it. 81, a werewolf is said to be rampaging in town. Okay, so they locked up a werewolf down there. Interesting. That's... I'll make this an NPC, because this could potentially be someone who could also provide some first insights into Orin, since this is potentially somebody who's crossed Orin and was punished by being thrown in there, and the fact that they're a werewolf is also the reason why they survived having their limbs broken and are currently just sustained by their supernatural side. Now, if I've done my math correctly, that is the requisite amount of rooms for today, which leaves us to, for the next building session, build our way towards the alternative route to the keep. And then I think we can already reach the keep, which I feel like the natural explanation there would be that the keep is not accessible for the majority of the month. It's kind of broken off from the main landmass of Galekirk, sort of floating in the chaos, almost like a upside down iceberg with a keep on top, and it's coming closer with the moon phases going towards moon dark. So on moon dark of the month it docks and then Orin comes forth, so we don't have to do much more building in this direction. We'll probably create kind of a passageway up here underground as an alternative route, and then one more approach here which leads to the edge of the landmass, and then the keep off in the distance, which doesn't really need to be hugely designed, because I think it's mostly just ruined and chaotic, and it's just the battleground where Orin can be encountered and fought. Which leaves it for me for this week to end it here. We still have a lot of playing to do. We still have a lot of fighting to do. So I will probably weave in sort of a play-only episode out of the building sequence, so we can actually play our way to the point past the Pitmaster and into this territory, so we can kind of loop it back also on the full moon night to pick up back in the crypta and then forward it to the Orin encounter at the end of the month. That is the plan. So I think there'll be one kind of a special episode just to catch up on our party, and then back to the buildings on Sunday and Thursday. And until then, thank you very much for watching. I'll catch you then, and bye for now.